Hey, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Poilly, and I'm the medical director of the Carefor Hospice. I've been doing this for about 4 years. I also have a special interest in the COVID-19 pandemic, and the best way for me to help is through doing vaccination clinics. So I try and do one vaccination clinic a week, and that's my special interest. So today I'm going to talk about the disease per se, and then what we've been able to do for it and what the ultimate solution for this pandemic is. And then I'll take some questions if anybody has any. So here's a picture of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the actual virus that gives you the disease. And I want you to take note that there's the gray ball, which basically has the disease, and then you've got these red spike proteins, these triangular things that are on the outside, and these spike proteins attach to your cells, and then you get the disease. But all our vaccines are based on the spike proteins. I'd like you to remember that. What is COVID-19? It's a disease caused by the virus that's called SARS-CoV-2, which stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. That was discovered in December 2019 in Wuhan, China. There is a nomenclature that all the viruses are named for, and so they've named this disease COVID-19, which stands for Coronavirus Disease 19 because it started off in 2019. I'd like to show you a table that shows you basically the difference between COVID and other epidemics that we've had. So this is a table that compares COVID versus SARS, which is what you remember from 2002 in Canada, versus seasonal flu, the influenza for which you take your annual vaccine, and the common cold. Middle of March 2021, after 1 year of our lockdown, the world had over 119 million cases and over 2 million deaths. Right now, a few months later, we're at nearly 4 million deaths in the world. SARS, we heard a lot about it, but there were only 8,100 cases and 774 deaths. Seasonal flu in the States will kill about 20,000 people in 1 year, and you'll have about 35 million cases in a year. The mortality doesn't seem that bad, 0.2 to 4%, but when you have many, many cases, it does translate into significant amounts of death. SARS, the mortality rate was 10%, so it's not as bad as SARS, thankfully. And the seasonal flu will kill 1 in 1,000, so 0.1%. So some basic information about COVID-19 is the incubation period, which is the time between you actually having a contact with somebody who's sick and you developing symptoms. Is very variable, but it can be up to 2 weeks. Most people will usually get symptoms at day 5 or 6. The transmission, unfortunately, is 50% asymptomatic, which means that you don't know who gave it to you because the person who gave it to you does not have any symptoms, either never will develop symptoms or is pre-symptomatic, so they will develop symptoms in the next few days. The mortality, as we reviewed before, is relatively low, 0.2 to 4%. In Ontario right now, it's 1.68%, meaning that, let's say you have 200 people in Ontario with COVID, 3 of those will die. So it's high enough. In Canada, as of a few days ago, we had over 26,000 deaths from COVID. And just in comparison, in World War II, over a period of 6 years, we lost about 45,000 Canadians. So in 1.5 years, we've lost more than half of the number of people that we lost during World War II. So it's there, definitely there, and it's significant. Severity of COVID-19, the highest risk factors for a bad outcome is age over 75. So that's why we started by vaccinating the older people, because they were the ones who were dying the most. High blood pressure, diabetes are independent factors for a bad outcome. The worst risk factor for people under the age of 65 is obesity, and that's independent of the usually associated hypertension and diabetes. If you're admitted to the hospital with COVID, your chances of dying are 15 to 20%. If you're admitted to the ICU because of your COVID, your chances of dying are 40%. The reproductive number, that's one of my favorite numbers. It's R0 or R0, and sometimes you'll see that in some tables. But basically, it's the number of people who will be infected by one sick person. So if you have one sick person, how many people will they infect? Will they infect 5 people? Will they infect one person? So let's say you have an R factor of 5. You have one sick person, they will infect 5 people. Those 5 people will infect 25 people. Those 25 people will infect 125. So if you have an R that's over 1, your epidemic just grows and grows and grows and grows. And at the beginning of the epidemic, the R factor ranged between 4.5 and 6.5. And that's why it spread like wildfire at the beginning. Once infection control measures were put into place, i.e. masks, physical distance, and hand washing, within 2 weeks, your R factor came down in the States from 4 to 1.5. So these measures, although we've heard them over and over and over again, they are incredibly important. The R factor will depend on restrictions. So the more the restrictions are lifted, the higher your R factor will go. And the more you put lockdowns, your R factor will become lower. So if you have an R factor of 1, for each sick person, you'll have another sick person. Your epidemic will remain stable. If your R factor is over 1, let's say 5, your epidemic just grows and grows and grows. Ideally, what you want is an R factor under 1. So for each sick person, you'll infect maybe half a person, or it will take 2 people to infect 1 person. And that's a sign that the epidemic is going down, or you're coming down the curve. So it's a little bit like looking at the iceberg under the water. We can usually see the tip of the iceberg with the numbers, but if you look underneath and you look at the R factor, that tells you a little bit about the future of what it's looking like. So transmission of the disease, how contagious is COVID? The highest risk of transmission is when you're within 6 feet of somebody who has COVID, who's talking, speaking, sneezing, or coughing for 15 minutes. If you stay within 15 minutes, within 6 feet of that person for 15 minutes, then you're at a high risk. There's growing evidence that SARS-CoV-2 is aerosolized, meaning that the small particles remain in the air, and that can remain in the air for hours. So if you're inside without masks in a poorly ventilated area and you had a COVID positive person in the room, that will stay in the room for several hours. And that's why restrictions start by saying, okay, spend time outside because it's better ventilated. The SARS-CoV-2 particles can also stay on surfaces for hours to days. And that's why we clean more often. More than 50% of the transmission of cases occurs from people who don't have any symptoms or are going to develop symptoms in the next few days. So, the fact that you're with somebody who looks well doesn't really mean that you're not going to get COVID. You can't rely on that to say that you're not going to get COVID. If you are going to get COVID, 2 to 3 days prior to you developing any symptoms, you will start shedding the virus to other people. The viral peak loads, meaning the amount of virus that you have in you that you can give to others, is the highest on day 1 of symptoms, which is usually you're not feeling that bad. You may just be feeling a little bit under the weather. You might go to work. You might take the public transportation to go to work. And that's when you're actually spreading the virus most. And often you're spreading it for about 10 days. And as it goes on, even though you're getting sicker, you're actually shedding it less. So truly what we call asymptomatic transmission, meaning giving the disease to somebody when you don't have any symptoms, is higher than we thought originally. So that's why COVID-19 is such a sneaky disease. The immunity that you get from, let's say you do get COVID, it will last, you will develop a natural immunity if you have a normal system, and that will last about 3 months. The immunity that you develop from the disease is not as strong as the immunity that you will get from the vaccine. So even though you may have had COVID in the past, it is highly recommended that you still get the vaccination because the immunity you get from the vaccination will be better and will last longer. So if you compare COVID versus Ebola, we used to hear a lot about Ebola. It's very drastic. But Ebola, you would have your contact fairly quickly. You would be sick within hours. You would be in bed and you're not able to travel around because you're just not feeling well. And you typically, 50% of them will die within short days of having the disease. So you really don't have time to spread the disease. You will give it to the people who are looking after you, but you won't give it to your neighborhood. SARS-CoV-2 is very different. Obviously, you can give it to people even though you don't have any symptoms, and that's why it spread so quickly, like wildfire. At the beginning of the pandemic, we heard about flattening the curve, and that's the mechanism as to why we have these lockdowns. So I'm going to show you a good video on flattening the curve.
You've heard the term flattening the curve, but what does it mean? Well, if you have a virus that's very infectious and you just let it run its normal course, then a lot of people get sick in a short period of time. And that can overwhelm the healthcare system if a significant percent of those people get seriously ill, as with this current coronavirus. But if you do things like social distancing, then you can reduce the rate of spread of the virus. So at any one point in time, there's not so many people sick, so you're less likely to overwhelm that healthcare capacity. Eventually, maybe the same number of people are going to get infected, but instead of it occurring over a few months, it occurs over many months. In addition, this extending the period of time over which people are getting infected means that there might be time to develop vaccines or antiviral therapies that could be given to more people than otherwise would occur. So flattening the curve, spreading out the patient load, essentially gives healthcare workers more time. And that is ultimately what's going to save lives.
So flattening the curve really helps the hospitals to be able to handle the rest of the people that need to come in. At the beginning of the pandemic, it prevented many, many early deaths and illnesses so that the hospitals weren't overwhelmed, and that's why we did the original lockdown. It gives you time to find cures. It gives you time to develop a vaccine and or currently vaccinating the population. That's what we're focusing on right now. And that is the reason why we have these lockdowns and social distancing, but especially the lockdowns. And when hospitals are overwhelmed, it doesn't just affect people who have COVID, but it affects everybody. So if you have a car accident and you need to have your spleen removed, if there are no beds and the ORs are closed, it just won't happen. So people, it's not just the COVID people who are going to suffer. They're not doing, preventive medicine such as mammograms and things like that. There are delays and knees aren't getting replaced. So it affects everybody when we don't flatten the curve. Healthcare workers, they're very special in my heart. Obviously, I'm one of them and I work with them. And we are totally reliant on healthcare workers for this pandemic. So they did a study of over 2 million people, and they found that frontline healthcare workers had 3 times the risk of catching COVID, obviously because they're more exposed and, so they're dealing with COVID all the time. So they get COVID more often than the general population. How are we doing in Ontario? It's all we hear about everybody in the world, but how are we doing in Ontario? So as of June 25th, which is a few days ago in Ontario, we've had over 500,000 cases. When you consider that the population of Ontario is 14 million people. So that means that 1 in 28 people in Ontario have had confirmed COVID. The chances are it's actually higher than that. So if you have a school class of 28 people, 1 of them has had COVID. We've had over 9,000 deaths in Ontario, which gives a death rate of about 1.68%. So that means that if you've got 200 people who have had COVID, and consider that 1 in 28 have had COVID, 3 of those people have died. Healthcare workers count for 23,500 cases, so about 4.3% of cases are healthcare workers. Just over 450 healthcare workers have been admitted to the hospital in Ontario. Just under 100 people, 97, have been admitted in ICU, and these are all healthcare workers. And unfortunately, 18 healthcare workers have died in Ontario. You've heard about mutations and variants, and that's what everybody's talking about right now because we're in that phase of the pandemic. And mutations happen any time that the virus reproduces. So when it goes from one person to the next, it will reproduce, and that gives it a chance to change slightly and to try and become more resistant to the measures that we're taking. So, for example, maybe the spike protein will change just ever so slightly, and then it will be easier to attach to the new person. So whenever you have a massive amount of people getting very sick, so like New York City at the beginning, India lately, that will cook, if you want, some variants and mutations. And the more a virus mutates, generally, the more resistant it will be to cures. Sometimes it will be more resistant to vaccines, but so far we've been lucky, other than the Delta one, and that the easier it will transmit to other people. So, for example, the Alpha variant, which came from the UK originally, that increased the R factor by 0.7. So if you had an R factor of 0.8, meaning your epidemic is going down, and you increase it by 0.7, now you're at 1.5. So you start mushrooming again, and your pandemic goes back up on another curve. So the quicker we vaccinate people, the quicker the pandemic will end, and it will end these formations of mutations. Often the mutations will have a higher mortality rate as well. So vaccination, that's where I'm coming to. The vaccination is the ultimate and really the only effective weapon in ending this pandemic. The way we got to getting this vaccine so quick was that it was an incredible collaboration between the scientists in the world. It was looked at globally. So the Chinese who had the virus at the beginning, they were able to sequence the genome, meaning able to figure out the DNA of the virus, of SARS-CoV-2, and then shared it with all the scientists around the world. And then everybody started working on creating vaccines. So many vaccines were being produced or developed at the same time. And I think this is probably one of the first times that the whole scientific world has collaborated together. The other thing is that we had lots of cases. We had tons of people with the disease, so we had lots of people to study, and many people were willing to participate in trials for vaccines and for treatments. And then, of course, lots of money was put into it. Typically, clinical trials will have phase 1, 2, and 3. And I'll go through this a little bit later. But in this case, we were able to do normally it would be phase 1, then phase 2, then phase 3. We were able to do this concurrently. The mRNA vaccines, which are Moderna and Pfizer, they are an incredible vaccine, and the technology has been around for decades, and it's been used for the last 10 years in cancer treatments. But they are actually much easier to modify and adjust and quicker to make. So that's why the mRNA vaccines came out quite quickly. Basically, all the vaccines work on the spike protein. So they try and reproduce the spike protein, and then you, in your body, try to fight that spike protein. And then when you get the coronavirus yourself, it will recognize the spike proteins of the virus, and it will attack the spike protein so that it cannot get into your cell. That's basically how all of them work, including the vector vaccines, which are the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson. All the vaccines make you create the spike protein. None of them inject any of the SARS-CoV-2 into you. So you cannot get COVID-19 from the vaccine. You may have it coincidentally at the same time. You may be pre-symptomatic, and then you develop symptoms within days of having the vaccine, but it's not from the vaccine. The other thing with these clinical trials is that we had lots and lots of people. So when they did the phase 3, where you normally would have large amounts of people, Pfizer had 43,500 people and Moderna had 30,000. They've never been able to study vaccines on this large number of people. It was actually 10 times larger. So the studies are great. And then these studies show that, we had 95% efficacy of these vaccines, which was more than we could ever hope for. We were kind of hoping for 50, 60%, and we got 95%. So normally when you do a phase 1 study, you take a small number of people and you study to see, try the different doses and see if you mount an immune response. So then on phase 2, you take a larger amount of people, and then you see if there are any side effects with a larger amount of people. And then in phase 3, you take many, many more people and see how effective it is against the disease. So that's basically how the clinical trials work. So this slide is a little bit small. I apologize for that. But this shows you how normally a vaccine would be developed in Canada. So you start off with scientists developing a vaccine, then it's studied on animals, then you do phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, one after the other. In this case, they were done concurrently. Then the scientists applied to Health Canada to get approval. Then Health Canada reviews all the data. Then they give the approval. This is over months, can take years. Then you start manufacturing the vaccine. Then you give the vaccine to people. And then over the next, still forever, you're monitoring for side effects of the potential of the vaccine. So no steps were skipped in the vaccine testing or in the approval process. Basically what happened is that people, we did the phase 1, 2, and 3 concurrently. There was a collaboration between the scientists and there was sharing of the genome at the beginning. The other step that they were able to go faster was that the Health Canada was reviewing data as it came along, not just waiting till the end to review all the data. So they were quite up to date with all the data, and the manufacturing actually started before getting approval. And we're still monitoring, obviously we're monitoring the side effects of the vaccine and the efficacy. So there was no skipping of any safety testing. I want to reassure you of that. And in fact, the trials were 10 times larger than any other vaccines because we had so many people that were willing to participate. The only one skipped step at the beginning is that the drug companies did not want to wait to see if the vaccine could stay in the fridge for 6 months because they didn't want to wait 6 months to see if it would be, if it could still be good. So basically what they said it was going to expire in a much shorter period, not knowing that if it would last longer, but now they know it can last longer. So that was the one step that was skipped. So I've got a couple of videos that explain how the mRNA vaccines work. I have these 2 videos and I couldn't make up my mind as to which one was better. One's a couple of minutes, the other one's 4 minutes. So I'm sorry guys, but I'm going to show you both because they are excellent.
So far, about 100 million people have been infected by COVID-19 worldwide, and the disease has claimed the lives of more than 2 million people. Today, a variety of vaccines have become available to effectively control the pandemic. The main difference between modern and traditional COVID-19 vaccines is that the modern mRNA vaccines do not contain the whole virus, but only the blueprint of an important component of it, called the spike protein. With the vaccine, only this blueprint, a short piece of RNA, enters our body without altering our genetic code. This small RNA sequence, when injected into the muscle, initiates the production of spike proteins, and then it degrades. With traditional vaccines, the viral proteins, including the key spike protein, are injected into the muscle, usually in the form of inactivated viruses. The subsequent process is similar for all vaccine types. Immune cells patrolling the body present the spike protein as a foreign material to the helper T cells, the conductors of the immune system. These T cells alert the executors of the immune reaction, the killer cells, and the antibody-producing cells. These cells are capable of protecting our bodies from the attack of the virus, while also creating memory cells that remember the spike proteins of the coronavirus, which were prepared for a later virus attack. The most important outcome of vaccination is the development of immune memory. If the coronavirus attacks after this, it has little chance of success. Antibodies cover the virus and thus prevent it from binding to our cells to cause infection. Cells that have already been infected are ruthlessly destroyed by killer cells, along with the viruses inside. With vaccination, 90% of the infections do not develop into a disease, and if they do, the course of the disease is much milder than without vaccination. These coronavirus vaccines have been given to several million people worldwide who have become protected against the development of the disease. The only efficient tool to eradicate the pandemic is vaccination. So get vaccinated and continue to keep the rules of social distancing and wearing a mask. Do not forget to wash your hands thoroughly and regularly. You can get detailed information on vaccines from your treating doctor or GP, or the doctors who are on duty at the vaccination points.
Developing vaccines is usually a very lengthy process, taking on average 8 years to get approved. Since a few years, we have the ability to create mRNA vaccines, which can be developed much faster. So how do these vaccines work? Are they safe, and how do they compare to traditional ones? But first you must understand how the immune system works. When a virus enters your body, it will attach itself to one of your cells and inject its DNA or RNA into it. This is like a blueprint for your cells, containing instructions on what the cell has to make. So in this case, the virus's RNA will tell your cell to make more copies of the same virus. They become factories, assembling new copies of the virus that can infect even more cells. But don't worry, our bodies have a defense system for foreign intruders. The immune system attacks any protein, virus, or bacteria that does not belong in our bodies, but it takes a few days for it to learn how to attack the intruder. Meanwhile, the virus factories are running non-stop, quickly replicating the virus and spreading it in your body. In other words, you start experiencing symptoms of whatever has infected you. After a few days, however, your immune system will have figured out how to attack the virus and will start producing antibodies. These attach themselves to the virus, preventing them from infecting more cells and marking them for destruction. As you can see, the immune system is remarkable, but it's slow to mount an attack. That is the reason why we can get sick in the first place. So to give it a helping hand, we developed vaccines. The main idea is to train your immune system to recognize and fight off an infection before it has occurred. Almost like showing your immune system a mugshot of the virus and saying, if you see this, kill it. There are various types of vaccines, but let's take a look at the new kid on the block, mRNA vaccines. To understand how they work, let's take the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. You might have seen pictures of the virus with its distinctive spikes. These spikes allow the virus to attach to specific cells in your body and infect them. Now, here's the key idea for the COVID-19 vaccine. What if we could train our immune system to recognize these spikes by having our own bodies produce them? To do that, researchers took the virus's blueprint, its RNA, and isolated the part responsible for producing the spikes. Armed with this blueprint, they created mRNA, or messenger RNA. This is a special form of RNA that can enter your cells and give them instructions. In this case, the RNA contains instructions to build the spikes of the coronavirus. Not the virus itself, just the spikes. So mRNA vaccines contain instructions for your cells that tell them to build a part of a virus in large volumes, almost like giving them a recipe to follow. Once this is happening, your immune system kicks into action and starts learning how to attack these intruders. Again, it takes some time for the immune system to fight off these spikes, but you won't get sick because it's only the spikes, not the virus itself. And that's it. Your immune system has learned how to attack the spikes of the coronavirus. It destroys all the spikes and even breaks down the mRNA vaccine itself. The only thing left in your body are special B cells or memory cells. These can linger around for months or years until the same virus infects you again. When that happens, the B cells can produce the correct antibodies right away, preventing the virus from spreading and making you sick. What's interesting about this mRNA technique is that it's relatively quick to develop a vaccine as soon as we know the DNA or RNA sequence of a virus. And secondly, because the vaccine only makes our bodies produce a tiny part of a virus, we cannot get sick from it. More traditional vaccines use weakened versions of the actual virus. This also triggers an immune response, but could also give you mild symptoms. Now you know how mRNA vaccines work.
So, for the vaccines, what I want to reinforce to you is that there's no SARS-CoV-2 in the vaccine, so you cannot get that COVID from the vaccine. Vaccines are incredibly safe. They decrease your chances of getting sick, seriously ill, or dying by 95%, so highly effective. If you do get sick with COVID despite having the vaccine, you will have less symptoms, they will be less severe, and you will also have less virus in you, so you will shed it less to other people. So you will not be less, there will be less asymptomatic transmission from you. So when you do take the vaccine, you're protecting yourself, you're protecting others around you, and you're stopping the mutations, because obviously if you can't give the disease to somebody else, then there are no new mutations that are being made or variants. And the other thing is that they didn't really skip any safety steps in the creation of this vaccine. So in conclusion, COVID is not a benign disease. It's a pretty bad disease and eventually will infect everybody. It's just a question of time before that happens. Physical distancing and social, public health measures do help to slow down the spread, but they will not stop it. The only way to stop it is through vaccination of the great majority of the population. Vaccines are safe. They protect you, everybody around you, your loved ones, and they stop the creation of mutations. We have to remember, though, that this is a global pandemic. And in order for the pandemic to end, it's not just vaccinating ourselves in North America, it's actually the whole globe has to be vaccinated. And we have to have the majority of the people vaccinated. So here are my sources. They're good sources. EMRAP is a very well-known, they're teachers of medicine in California, and they're very well-known. They put on these big conferences. And they're actually the ones writing the chapter on COVID-19. So I hope this has been helpful, and my goal was to just give you more information on what the vaccines are and how they work, and to give you a little bit more information on the actual disease, because sometimes we kind of we're sick of hearing about it and we don't really want to know any more about it. But the facts are the facts, and it's a bad disease and nobody really wants to have it. So thank you for your attention, and I hope this is helpful to you. Thank you very much.